There are stories that do not begin with a grand event, but simply unfold like an old wooden door quietly creaking open to the morning light. This is one such story, not loud, not intense, just gentle like the wind brushing against a curtain, the faint scent of jasmine tea in an old kitchen, or sunlight slipping through an attic window. If you're feeling tired, unsteady, or simply looking for a place to rest, your mind sit down. Let your shoulders relax. Take a deep breath. The story you're about to hear is the journey of a girl from silence to tenderness, from loss to renewal. A journey not taken with footsteps, but with the heart slow, peaceful, and full of love. Together, we will pass through old rooms, warm cups of tea, sunlit windows, and delicate strands of memory. There, you may find a part of yourself, a part that once felt sorrow, once felt lost, but then learned how to smile again at life. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath in, and gently breathe out. Tonight's journey will take you to a quiet little attic, where past and present blend in the gentle rhythm of memory. That early morning, the sky had just begun to lighten. The first rays of sunlight quietly crept across old tiled roofs, slipping through the dusty glass windows of a small attic on the top floor of a building on Maynard Street. Inside, the space was utterly still, with only the soft whisper of wind nudging a white curtain, creating a gentle motion like the breath of someone sound asleep. The young girl was still curled up under a thin blanket, her face peaceful, as if time outside couldn't reach her. Resting on her chest was an old silver necklace, the only keepsake left by her mother. It felt a little cold against her skin, but to her, it was a familiar sensation. Each morning upon waking, she would gently place her hand on it like a whispered greeting to the past. From afar came the soft clinking of a bread seller's bicycle bell, and the chirping of sparrows hopping from branch to branch somewhere near the balcony below. The morning air blended with the scent of aged wood in the room. She slowly opened her eyes without haste, letting the light ease into her vision like a quiet morning ritual. She sat up, pulled on a worn-out wool sweater, and walked toward the teapot resting on the windowsill. The tea from last night was still slightly warm. She poured it gently into a small porcelain cup and brought it to her lips. The scent of tea spread slowly, tenderly, like a wordless melody. She sighed softly and allowed herself to sit there for a long while. The little attic needed no words, no change. It only needed to exist like a quiet embrace for a weary soul. Traces of sleep still lingered on her eyelashes, but it was the kind of dreaminess she didn't wish to brush away. And so, she sat in the soft light of early morning, letting each drop of time seep into her like gentle rain falling into a peaceful heart. The days spent in that attic had no names, no numbers marked on a calendar. Time there was not counted by hours or minutes, but by the sound of wind slipping through cracks in the door, by the rhythm of a neighbor's cat, occasionally strolling along the windowsill. She woke when sunlight had slipped past the thin curtain, casting warm beams on the chipped wooden table. No alarm was needed. Her body knew when it had rested enough, like a flower opening and closing in rhythm with nature. Each morning, she brewed tea. Black tea is for chilly days, and jasmine tea is for moments in need of calm. The kettle crackled gently as it boiled, spreading warmth into her cold hands. The tea's soft fragrance was like someone quietly whispering hello. She carried the cup to the window, where gentle sunlight streamed in. With each sip, she closed her eyes, letting the warm taste slide down her throat, like water cradling an unnamed sorrow. Outside, distant voices chatted in the streets, and the sound of wheels gliding gently on the pavement felt as if wrapped in a thin veil of silk, never noisy, just enough to remind her that the world was still moving. At noon, she often lay down to read. Her mother's old books, their pages yellowed with time, still carried the scent of memory. Sometimes she would close the book, lie on her side, and watch the sunlight cast rectangular shapes on the wall. Her eyelids would slowly fall, and a soft afternoon nap would come like a gentle scarf. In dreams, she saw herself as a little girl, holding her mother's hand, walking through golden fields. The wind swept through her hair, and her mother's voice echoed like a lullaby with no words. Afternoons were a time for quiet. She cleaned the little room slowly, as if caressing each memory. Her mother's photo was straightened, and a wildflower she had picked the day before was placed in a glass jar. She wrote a few lines in her notebook, not a diary, but fragments of feelings. Perhaps a line of longing, a memory that passed through, or simply the way the wind sounded different today. As night fell, she lit a small candle, its flame dancing like a heart being reborn. She brewed tea again, this time chamomile. Its fragrance was like a distant embrace. She sat quietly by the window, letting her soul drift with the pale yellow glow of streetlights. Inside, everything was gentle, and her soul, though still full of silences, was beginning to remember how to smile. These were nameless days, but filled with small, beloved things. They helped her gradually step out of the fog of sorrow, as softly as each dawn came to greet the attic window once again. The attic on Maynard Street was never truly silent, even in its quietness. There were small sounds as subtle as breath that one could only sense when truly at peace. On moonless nights when the city below had drifted into sleep, she lay on her bed, one hand resting gently on her chest where the necklace lay, and listened. The ticking of an old wall clock echoed steadily like a lullaby woven from time. Occasionally, a soft breeze brushed through the cracks in the door, whispering faintly as if someone from a far-off place was trying to speak. Once she thought she heard her mother singing the words, unclear, just a hazy echo like a memory not yet fully formed. Dripping water from the kitchen faucet added a gentle rhythm, weaving between the wind and the clock. Now and then, the sound of the old neighbor's cat walking across the tiled roof filtered in. These sounds gathered together, formed a symphony of stillness, not the silence of emptiness, but the quiet of presence. In that stillness, she would sometimes close her eyes and imagine her mother sitting in the chair beside the bed. The faint scent of jasmine shampoo lingered in the air. She wouldn't open her eyes for fear that, if she looked, her mother would disappear. Those nighttime sounds, though soft, carried a quiet healing power. They didn't erase the sadness, but made it gentler like a silk ribbon laid out beneath the moonlight. And so, in that hushed space, the girl slowly drifted into sleep, not because she was tired, but because her mind at last felt sheltered. One December morning, when the cold crept through every crack in the wall, a knock echoed from the attic door. The sound startled her. It had been a long, long time since anyone had climbed those old stairs to find her. At the door stood an elderly woman with kind eyes holding a small wooden tray with a piece of bread and a steaming cup of tea. It was Mrs. Rose, the woman who lived on the second floor, who was once her mother's close friend. "You're so thin. It's cold today. I made some buttered toast. Drink this tea to warm up, all right." Mrs. Rose spoke in a low, even tone, as if afraid any note too sharp might disturb the fragile silence of the attic. The girl hesitated. So, used to solitude, she didn't know how to respond to such gentle kindness. But then she opened the door, invited Mrs. Rose in, and they sat together by the window, where the rare sunlight cast a thin golden thread across the floor. Mrs. Rose spoke of her mother, of afternoons past when the two women would sit together in the backyard, drinking jasmine tea, talking about books, new hand-knitted sweaters, and dreams for her little girl. Your mother always smiled softly, eyes tinged with sorrow. But when she talked about you, something in her lit up in the most beautiful way. The girl sat still. Those words felt like a soft breeze turning a page she thought had long been closed. The faint scent of jasmine tea drifted through the room, carrying her back to a distant afternoon, where her mother sat knitting a scarf and smiling gently. From that day on, Mrs. Rose would visit from time to time, not often, not noisily, sometimes bringing a sprig of lavender, a small loaf of bread, or a scrap of a letter written in wobbly handwriting. And she, though she never said it aloud, began to look forward to those gentle knocks at the door. They felt like another breath of the attic's slow patient and strangely warm. That afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the window, she decided to clean the picture frames hanging on the wall. Each frame held a memory, a small piece of the past, sometimes vivid, sometimes as hazy as mist. When she reached the oldest photo, a portrait of her mother in her youth, she discovered a small piece of paper sealed behind the back of the frame. Curious, she gently peeled it off. It was a small watercolor painting, faded with time. In the picture, a little girl sat by the window holding a book, while a woman beside her knitted a scarf. The sun tilted, casting soft golden light through the window frame. Below, in smeared brown ink, was the caption, "Mother and Daughter, a February Afternoon." In that very moment, the memory returned so clearly, she could hear the soft clinking of knitting needles, the turning of pages, and the faint scent of baked goods in the air. Her mother had been knitting a pale blue scarf while she was engrossed in a fairy tale book. They hadn't said much, just sat side by side in a strange, perfect peace. The little girl she once was had thought if time could stop, that moment would be the perfect place. She held the painting for a long time, then gently placed it into the frame, no longer hidden behind it. She wanted that every time she looked up, she could live that simple moment again, a peaceful afternoon where love didn't need to be spoken. That night, she dreamed. In the dream, her mother was sitting in the old chair beside the bed, finishing the last rows of the scarf. When she approached, her mother looked at her and smiled. She didn't speak, but those eyes were enough to warm an entire winter. She awoke in the middle of the night, not feeling cold at all. Outside, the wind still blew, but within her heart, for the first time in so long, there was a gentle light. That morning, the sky was unusually clear, as if the whole city had been rinsed clean after a long rain. The early sunlight flooded the attic, touching the fluttering white curtain and casting a glow on her face as she sat quietly by the window. Outside, birdsong rose like an overture to something just beginning. She stood up, pulled on her ash-gray sweater, and walked toward the door. She looked at her hand resting on the doorknob, gently yet enough to make her heart tremble. How long had it been since she last stepped out of the attic? She couldn't recall. All she knew was that something inside had softened today, and she wanted to try stepping out. The old staircase creaked softly with each step, like whispered greetings. She walked slowly, her feet touching the dusty steps for the first time in ages. When she opened the door and stepped outside, she took a deep breath. The air was cold, but strangely pure. A breeze swept through her hair, blowing fine strands behind her ears. On the sidewalk, yellow leaves scattered and rustled beneath her steps. The sounds weren't loud, but delicate like a lullaby, guiding her through a world both familiar and new. People smiled as they passed, cars rolled slowly through the intersection, and the sunlight reflected gently off shop windows. She stopped by the bakery at the corner, where the scent of butter always lingered in the wind. She bought a small loaf of bread, then sat on a bench at a nearby park. The lake was still reflecting the deep blue sky and the bare trees asleep for the winter. It looked like a traditional ink painting, quiet yet full of life. She broke off a piece of the bread, sipping jasmine tea from the thermos she brought along. The tea smelled sweet, the bread melted softly. Everything was simple, yet it brought tears to her eyes. Not out of sadness, but because she realized the world had always been this gentle. She just hadn't been calm enough before to see it. She sat for a long while, savoring each slow-moving moment. When she stood to leave, her shoes glided lightly over the tiled path, like a quiet dance. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled softly like a snowflake melting in the first light of winter sun. Since the day she stepped out of the attic, her life seemed to breathe again gently, little by little, like a tender bud pushing through after a long, sleeping winter. She woke earlier now, no longer lingering in bed until noon, as she once did. The morning light slipped into the room, caressing her cheek softly, waking her with a wordless language. She began her days with gentle music, soothing piano melodies flowing through the space like warm water. The window corner, where her mother's picture once stood, now held a new addition, a small lavender plant, a gift from Mrs. Rose. She watered it daily, watching each new leaf unfurl like a quiet miracle. While waiting for the kettle to boil, she would sit and write, not much, just a few lines, but honest feelings, no longer veiled behind the fog of memory. Her morning tea changed each week. Some days it was mint, others chamomile, or a new herbal blend she had just tried. She rediscovered joy in the small things, the bubbling of water in the kettle, the fragrance when opening a fresh tea bag, or simply the warmth of the cup in her hands. At night, she no longer stayed up late. Instead, she lit a candle, early played soft background music, and gave herself time to read. Each page felt like a gentle hug soothing her mind. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother, but now her mother was no longer sad. She stood in a garden, hair gently blowing, holding the finished blue scarf. When she approached, her mother smiled and waved, saying nothing, but her eyes held enough warmth to wake her in unfamiliar peace. One morning, she stepped out onto the balcony, flinging open the old attic door. The wind rushed in, sending the white curtains flying like strands of memory swirling through the room. But this time, she didn't hold them back. She let the wind carry away the past, allowing the attic to breathe with the new season. And so, day by day, the little attic remained quiet, but within it, a heart had learned how to forgive, how to go on, not forgetting, but no longer frozen in the past. That girl, once wrapped in loneliness, now knew how to smile while pouring a cup of tea, how to say thank you when receiving a flower, and understood that though her mother was no longer here, love remained in every new moment of life. One gentle rainy afternoon, after many months spent exploring the world outside, she returned to the attic like someone coming home to a long-lost embrace. The room was the same, the scent of old wood, the little lavender pot on the window ledge, and the thin white curtain fluttering whenever the breeze passed by. She sat down on the wooden chair beside her writing desk, opening the old notebook that had grown thick with added pages. For the first time in months, she wrote not to heal, but to give thanks. Thanks for the stillness, for the sorrow, for the days spent alone in silence. Outside, the rain fell steadily like the earth's slow, steady breath. She poured herself a cup of jasmine tea, her hands gently cradling the warm porcelain. A thought passed, perhaps one day she would invite someone to this attic and tell them about a time when she lived slowly, deeply, and learned how to love life again. She smiled softly, resting her forehead against the window pane. Cold wind slipped into her sleeves, but her heart was warm. That spring came late. Light drizzles lingered, brushing gently against the tiled roofs like whispered words. The girl still lived in the small attic, but everything now felt different. In the brilliant light of March, the room seemed to bloom. She had started working again, not some grand career, but selling books at a small used bookstore down the street. The shop was cozy, quiet, filled with the scent of old pages and the familiar sound of turning pages. Each day she sat behind the counter, jotting down simple notes, reading a few pages, chatting with strangers who felt oddly familiar. At noon, she came home to have lunch with Mrs. Rose. They often cooked simple meals together: pumpkin porridge, pepper-braised fish, or the banana bread her mother used to make. Some days Mrs. Rose shared stories from her youth. Other times, they simply sat quietly sipping tea under the slanting light of the afternoon. On weekends, she joined a painting class at the community center. Her first paintings were clumsy but full of emotion. In one of them, she painted her mother knitting, the first time she allowed her to appear, not through memory, but through the colors she chose herself. She gradually became comfortable opening her heart. Once, an old friend sent her a letter. They met at a small cafe with soft jazz playing. She realized then that she had learned how to sit beside someone without feeling empty. Each night she still returned to the familiar attic. The scent of warm tea, the gentle wind, and the soft glow of candlelight still greeted her like faithful friends. But now, when she sat by the window, she no longer only looked back, she began to see what was blooming ahead. And so, life continued, gently, fully. Each day a new flower, and she, the one who had once feared her own shadow, had now learned to reach out for the light. June came. She left Maynard Street, not out of bitterness nor to forget, but because her heart longed for a wider life. The little attic remained behind, like an old friend who held no grudges, quietly watching her footsteps fade into the distance. She packed everything into a few small suitcases, books, a few outfits, an old picture frame, and a pouch of dried jasmine her mother once gave her. The new city appeared through a veil of morning mist. It wasn't like Maynard. There were more trees, more traffic, more noise. But something about this place didn't scare her. It was as if the city itself had open arms for those who had once been broken. She rented a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. The window looked out over a park with a lake, and every morning sunlight poured in from the left, something that made her feel like her mother was there, pulling the curtain aside to wake her up. She found work at a book cafe tucked into a quiet alley where people read as they sipped warm tea. There she met Lena, the cafe owner, about her age, with a warm smile and a habit of placing fresh flowers in teapots instead of vases. Lena didn't ask much, but she always knew when to offer silence and when to say just enough for someone to open their heart. She also met Eli, a young man who painted street scenes. He often sat across from the cafe sketching everyday life. One day he gave her a drawing of herself, reading behind the window. On the edge of the paper, he wrote, "Everyone has a window to return to and a door to walk through." In the evenings, she still wrote. Her stories were no longer sad, but like soft breezes passing through the heart. She wrote about Mrs. Rose, about the photo frame, about the attic, and about herself, the self from yesterday, and the self that was slowly changing. The new city didn't make her forget Maynard. It just helped her remember it differently, more gently, without pain. And whenever she sat by her new window, watching the tree branches sway in the wind, she smiled. She was no longer afraid to begin. Because now she knew, no matter the place, no matter the beginning, if the heart is open enough, any city can become home. That first autumn in the new city, she had Lena and Eli like two gentle sprouts growing in unfamiliar soil. Her friendship with Lena deepened with every cup of tea they made for each other each afternoon. Lena loved telling stories, and she listened. But gradually, she also learned to share. They spoke about their mothers, their childhood dreams, and the missing pieces of their hearts. Lena invited her to Eli's first photo exhibition. In the small room lined with sketches, she stood silently in front of one drawing, a girl sitting behind a window pane, bathed in slanted light, a book in her hands, and a smile as soft as candlelight. Below it, Eli had written, "All peace begins with someone who knows how to listen." From that day on, they saw each other more often. No rush, no expectations. Eli didn't ask much, and she didn't explain. They sat by the lake, drank coffee, doodled on napkins, and shared long silences that never felt heavy. One evening, it rained. Eli stood at the bookshop door with an umbrella, waiting for her to finish her shift. When she stepped out, he handed her the umbrella, and they walked together under the rain shoulder to shoulder, their steps falling in rhythm. The rain no longer felt cold. She turned to look at him, and for the first time saw in her eyes a scene without the past, only the tender present. They never gave their relationship a name, but she knew that each time Eli appeared with a small flower or an awkward story, her heart calmed like still water after a gentle breeze. Once Eli invited her to visit his hometown, a peaceful hillside with a wooden house and rows of pines lining the narrow path. She sat on the porch, a cup of tea in hand, listened to the birds at dawn, and felt like she was no longer lost. Her friendship with Lena remained like an underground stream, steady and gentle. They baked together, read books, and sat beside each other when the wind turned cold. Lena once said, "Some people come into your life not to change it, but simply to soothe it." She thought both Lena and Eli were like that, gentle yet deep enough to stay. And so, surrounded by new people in a new city, she lived truly new days, no longer just healing, but beginning to love life in a fuller, steadier way. Time passed slowly, like morning footsteps in a quiet park. Each day she walked familiar streets, bought a crusty loaf of bread, a fresh flower for the small vase by the window, and sometimes a few peaches from the elderly vendor on the corner. She no longer counted the days since moving to the city. Everything had become as natural as breathing. The city had become a part of her, and she no longer felt like a guest in her own life. Eli kept drawing, and Lena still placed flowers in teapots each morning. They hadn't changed much, but it was their quiet constancy that gave her strength. They had become family not by blood, but through presence, gentleness, and unconditional care. One day, Lena invited her to co-create a small corner in the bookshop, a space for writers and those learning to live slowly. She said yes. They named the space the sky within a place, to write to share, to be still to breathe. There she hosted small readings telling soft stories about the old attic or about her solitary walks in the rain. Eli sketched everyday moments. She was always part of those sketches, not because she was special, but because she was present. Once he whispered, "When you came into my life, time began to slow down." And then one afternoon, with autumn gently arriving, they sat on the rooftop, watching sunlight filter through the trees. Eli reached out and held her hand. He said nothing, but the gentle grasp was enough to say, "I'm staying." To her, that was enough. No promises, no bindings. Just someone to drink tea with, to walk through the mornings beside, to share the silences. She was no longer the sad girl in the attic on Maynard Street. She was someone who was rewriting her story day by day, with simple things, with ordinary people, with a quiet love deep enough to stay. And just like that, in that city, she found home. There was no warning when everything changed. One early winter afternoon, Lena suddenly left the city. She received news that her father was seriously ill and left behind only a short note. "I'll be gone for a while, maybe a long while. Please take care of the shop for me." She stood inside the bookstore, pale golden sunlight streaming through the glass door. The room was still quiet, but Lena's absence felt like a missing heartbeat. The flowers in the teapots began to wilt as if mourning something unnamed. She sat in their usual corner, brewed a pot of tea like always, and placed down 2 cups, one for herself, one for the one no longer there. Eli didn't say much. He simply sat beside her, her hand in his, in silence. Together, they held on to the warmth Lena had left behind in the books she chose, in the faint scent of cinnamon on the cushions, in the gentle melodies still lingering from the small speaker. The absence of someone familiar can stir up a deep loneliness, especially in those who have once been broken. But this time, she did not fall. She remembered the old attic in Maynard, where she had once learned how to live slowly to love herself, and to hold sadness without letting it consume her. Each morning, she still opened the shop. Each evening, she still placed a flower in the tea corner. She began writing more, not only for herself, but also for Lena and for anyone who had ever left. She wrote as if it were a way to weave invisible threads between those who were no longer near, but never truly gone. Eli kept drawing. In one new sketch, he captured her sitting behind the counter, sunlight falling gently on her hair, with an empty chair behind her. On the table, 2 cups of tea. Beneath the drawing, he wrote, "One leaves, one tends the flame, and the space in between is longing." She hung the picture on the wall right by the window. Each time she looked at it, she understood life never stops. It only transforms into something else, quieter, deeper, and often more beautiful. The next spring, the park outside the bookstore bloomed with new green buds. The old flamboyant tree where Lena and she once sat sipping tea now shimmered with green leaves. Beneath that tree, she placed a simple wooden chair. No sign, no note. But everyone knew it was a place for those who needed to sit and breathe a little more slowly. The girl she once was had grown into a calm woman. In her eyes was a quiet resilience, but no shadow of sorrow. She spent her days teaching children how to write, hosting small art classes on Saturday afternoons, and occasionally telling stories to grown-ups learning how to forgive themselves. One day, a little girl with messy hair walked into the bookstore, shyly asking to borrow a children's book. She smiled, handed the girl the same book her mother used to read to her, then brewed a small cup of jasmine tea. When the girl left, she stood quietly for a long while, watching her go, as if seeing herself from years ago, when she first learned what tenderness felt like. That night, she and Eli sat together on the porch watching the moon rise. He handed her a sheet of paper. On it was a drawing of a small wooden house on a pine-covered hill with a large window facing the sun. "What do you think about moving there?" Eli asked gently with no rush. She looked at the drawing in silence, took a deep breath. "I'll bring the teapot, a few notebooks, and the wooden chair under the old tree," she replied, smiling. And just like that, another journey began. Not dazzling, not loud, but steady, like the roots of an old tree beneath the earth. because she knew after all the seasons of rain and sun, after all the losses and the love, she had learned how to live with all the gentleness in her heart. The little house on the pine-covered hill gradually became a part of her, like a new rhythm of breath. In the early morning, sunlight poured through the large window, facing the sun, stretching across the warm wooden floor. The calls of birds, the rustling of leaves, the soft bubbling of a boiling kettle, all blended into a gentle soundtrack for a life no longer hurried. She and Eli tended the small garden in front of the house together. Each season they planted different things, sometimes carrots, sometimes cucumbers, and sometimes just a patch of wild daisies. In the afternoons, they would sit in the garden, reading to each other a passage from a book, a poem, or simply sharing small fragments of their day. One day they received a letter from Lena, now living with her family in a faraway region. In the letter she wrote, "I still make tea every morning, but there's no one to drink it with. I miss you both." After reading, she placed the letter in the glass jar on the table, where she kept important things. By candlelight that night, she whispered, "We're still here, always waiting." That winter, a stranger came by, a middle-aged man, thin with tired eyes. He passed by the house and noticed the small sign hanging on the porch, "We have tea and a place to sit." He stepped in. She made tea. They asked nothing of each other. They just sat, drank tea, and listened to the wind passing over the roof. When he left, he wrote a line in the guest book. "I've been to many places, but I've never felt peace like I did here." She read it, smiled, and knew home is not where the walls are, or the roof, but where one is heard, where one can sit in stillness, and where one can see oneself. She and Eli continued living that way one day at a time, like tiny flames lighting the palms of their hands. They didn't need long-term plans. They only needed each other, and the occasional visitors, each bringing a story, leaving behind a trace of tenderness in the little wooden house. And so, the story went on, gently, without an end, like a door that always stays open, welcoming light people and all the unnamed things life brings. Years passed. Winter returned to the hill, with silver frost coating the old pine branches. The little wooden house still stood, its roof weathered by time, but the large window still opened each morning, greeting the sun like it did the very first time. Eli aged with quiet grace. His vision faded, but his hands still knew how to draw simple strokes. His paintings were no longer detailed, they were feelings. He said, "I don't draw to be praised, but to remember how the light once fell on your face." She too grew old, her hair touched by silver, her hands thinner, yet she still brewed tea every morning, still placed 2 cups on the table, a habit she could never replace. They sat together often, speaking less than before, but their eyes were always full of quiet words. Once she said, "We don't need to do anything more, just stay here and wait for spring to return." One late autumn day, Eli smiled at her, then fell into a deep sleep. His hand was still in hers. No one cried. Inside the house, there was only the scent of tea and the sound of wind slipping through the windowsill. She placed his final sketch on the table, an image of 2 elderly people sitting on the porch, their shadows stretching long in the afternoon light, with the words, "Forever, a gentle evening." Another season passed, and one spring morning, she too departed, gently like a petal falling onto the doorstep. A neighbor found her still holding a dried lavender flower. Beside the bed, her notebook lay open with one final line. "Thank you, life, for being kind to me until the very last moment." The wooden house is now a resting place for travelers. The sign on the porch remains. "We have tea and a place to sit." No one knows exactly who the 2 elderly people were, but everyone who visits leaves with a stillness in their heart, as if someone had gently touched the deepest part of them and whispered, "You are not alone." The girl's life, from the little attic on Maynard Street to the wooden house among pine-covered hills, was a quiet, gentle, and tender melody. No dramatic climax, no grand victory. But each day, each person she met, each cup of tea she poured, was an honest, delicate note. From the early days of hiding in loneliness, she had learned how to face her pain, not erase it, not run from it, but hold it as part of the journey. And from within that embrace, she began to heal through the repetition of simple things: a warm cup of tea, a dusted picture frame, an unnamed morning. Once someone afraid to open her heart, she had learned to smile at strangers, to listen to others' stories without losing herself. Friendship, love, farewells. They all came and went like seasons, and she, without clinging quietly, kept the good things in her heart. She didn't leave behind a great legacy, nor did her name travel far. But what remained was a wooden house with its door open to strangers, soft lines in a worn notebook, and the peaceful feeling someone might carry home after a quiet visit. The final lesson of her life was as simple as life itself. Do not fear sadness, and do not fear stillness. Live slowly, listen to yourself, and be gentle with everything you meet. Life is not meant to be fully understood, but to be felt one moment at a time with a heart that has learned how to love. And then, like the scent of jasmine tea gently fading into the air, she closed the chapter of her life, leaving behind a soft resonance, making those who came after pause in silence and smile